is now?
So I think it was really courageous of all of the organisations to take on that way, and I think our whole team knew that that's what we had to do.
Sorry, just on that, why do you think it was definitely very courageous. Why do you think they felt that they could do it? Because I feel like we created the right environment for that courage to come through. And that when I say we, I'm talking about Mark, EMA, myself, Monica, and the team, but the convening power of the Commonwealth,
yes,
and the leadership of Mark, I think went a long way for people to feel like they could actually be courageous. Sorry.
I think you put your finger on it. I think that...
And they trusted us.
So, I mean, I had to produce lit reviews on the neuropsychology, the science of why stories matter. So I did a series of interviews with film producers, writers.
I remember that. It was fantastic.
Delved quite deep into the literature of how humans are hardwired to make sense of their world through stories. The neurobiology of things like, now that we've got the instrumentation to measure things like brainwaves, how people's brainwaves can synchronize when they listen to symphonic music, for example. How when somebody watches a movie or reads a book that's deeply moving, it can change the resting state of their brain for hours, if not days afterwards. How those hormonal cocktails, it's sometimes called, there's a Swedish researcher, I can't remember his name, but they call the angel cocktail or the devil's cocktail. So the angel's cocktail of hormones is a mix of endorphins, which you can stimulate through humour and laughter, and make you feel good and make you feel collaborative. Oxytocin, which is that feeling of care and compassion and love that builds trust and bonding relationships. And then the third one is endorphins. There's a third one, the suspense one. Which one is that?
I don't know.
It's the sense of suspense. What's it? It's another hormone. But anyway, you stimulate that through a sense of suspense.
Okay.
So you stimulate people's curiosity, and that sharpens focus and sharpens mental acuity.
As you're telling that story and explaining that, I can relate to it.
Yes,
because
we all know it intuitively.
We all know it intuitively.
We know it intuitively. We've got the science behind it now. Conversely, the devil's cocktail of hormones is adrenaline and cortisol, which are created by those are the ones that cause fight or flight, and create stress and often conflict and reactivity. And so I felt like we were trying to create in the workshops and within the team this kind of angel's cocktail by constructing a very strong science-based narrative that took you through a beginning, a middle and an end, made you feel involved, made you feel focused, stretched your imagination, gave you a dilemma, because that's where the learning space is when there's an unresolvable dilemma. You know what you want for a future, but this is what you're going to get. That sense of uncertainty that it creates, but within a safe psychological space, allows the room to grow and learn, but also to form bonds with the people that you go through that experience with. That was all very intentionally designed. In the bigger scheme of things, that little team was working in a place within organisations where often it's the devil's cocktail. The fast-moving policy environment in EMA, the government situation that we were in. I mean, Mark did buffer us from some of that, but there's this constant sense of reactivity. We've got to have something tomorrow. Actually, we have got to have that by yesterday. No, it's not good enough. No, we've changed our mind, within each of the organisations. And so I did feel like we created that little space to the point that, at least as a team, I often felt like we had this level of trust where you would allow me and I would allow you to was unscrew the top of your head, have a little fiddle and
Yes.
poke around with your brain, rearrange ideas. I mean, that is a very deep level of trust
Absolutely.
to allow somebody else
Yeah.
into your actual headspace.
Yeah.
And I think that across the organisations, that team that you built,
Yeah.
we allowed each other to do that. And then once there's a nucleus of people, and then the validation within across organisations, it gave each organisation the
courage.
legitimacy and courage to
Keep going.
to go further down and actually invite all these state-based people to these workshops.
Wow.
Yeah.
I remember myself, this is just my reflection on, there were times when, you know, I would, the bit of a spiral, the death spiral, the devil's cocktail, dog, bless her.
Throw something at it.
No, she's all right.
Lala.
No, she's all right.
Oh, she's
she's okay.
snoring.
The dog's snoring in the background, that's okay.
It's been such a tough old morning at the beach.
The sort of, I used to be on such highs at times, knowing, and for me, because being the translator in chief
Yes.
of science policy practice,
Yes.
politics, you know, sort of trying to keep everything ticking along nicely. Mark and I having conversations every now and then when I get frustrated, and I would test with him if I felt like there was something happening that might affect the project in some way. You know, my spidey senses would go, "Oh, like, Mark, I need to tell you about this," and we talk it through. And give options as to what I think might happen, and check in with him and say, "Do you think we should keep going?"
Yes.
That happened a couple of times where I felt like, in fact, I think I've got a comment in my notes about this, that the Commonwealth is going to be on a hiding to nothing because it was so complex, uncertain, difficult. What you've just described with what the agencies were going through, I felt for them.
Yes.
So I was like, okay, what do I need to do to make adjustments to overcome that sort of situation? But there were so many times when we would come together as a group, though, and I'm talking about all the age of the Bureau of Meteorology people, the CSIRO teams, our team, your team, the advisory group that we got together, and we would test the thinking. We would check in. We would make sure that the comfort level was... And I remember time and time again having this overwhelming sense of, oh my God, we are on the right track. We have to keep going. So that courage needed to kick back in again, and that, no, we have to keep going. Hell or high water, we're going to have to keep going. Did you ever feel that?
Oh, all the time. All the time. Because, so I think what you just described is really important, that you had the core team, and then there was an advisory team, which was a team of experts.
And senior experts from all sectors.
And then there was the partnership team, which were the state-based actors who worked alongside us. And then there was each individual agency's kind of line management. And I think, in a sense, having those different groups, every time one agency or one group might have got a little bit of the jelly wobbles, the fact that there was this sort of safety net of we're cross-checking in a really open way with each other, and we all think this is where we need to go.
Keep going.
And it was done in a professional way. It was a formalised governance structure with regular meetings, with notes and minutes and decision making within that. And I think if you're going to do something this bold, you need to give yourself that safety net. And also the project team was really responsive to, you know, when they wanted to take it, you know, it was an adaptive project, so we would adapt.
I was just going to say,
on where people
we would not
wanted to
put
go.
up the, you know, stop.
No.
It would be like, pause,
Yeah.
explain more
Reflect,
about what's happening.
explain.
Let's talk it through.
That's
Let's
right.
work out, you know, what the consequences might be. work it through together. I found
so
that
I think
incredibly valuable.
That the science was important, but and the core team was important, but equally important was the governance structure. That took a lot of resources to keep that governance structure alive and functional.
Monica was superb with her relationship management skills.
Absolutely. She's a relational leader. She's absolutely a relational leader. She's an expert, and she doesn't always recognise her strength in that. But she is just the embodiment of a relational leader.
Yeah.
So I think that all of those elements are reasons that the project had legs. And still has legs, because the thing is that all of those people went back into their own worlds and have taken that thinking and those relationships and the way of thinking, I suppose, back into their new roles or their day jobs.
Yeah, we touched quite a few, at least 250 people that were intimately involved in the project, and then others that came to the workshops and various other activities that happened once, post-project. We touched quite a few people, and I see, because I took myself out of that world for a little while, because it was pretty intense, and I was coming off the back of quite a few other big projects that I'd done within AFAC, and I felt burnt out when I got back home, and it was interesting because I did this to myself. I sold my house in Victoria, and once I finished the secondment with the Commonwealth, I also finished my role with AFAC, so I was jobless and homeless. I used to laugh about it because it didn't really bother me that much, or did it? So that sort of leadership fatigue that I felt, I'm not the only one. There's quite Monica went, I'm sure when we talk to Mon, she will say it's the same, that it did take its toll. It was the intellectual horsepower that had to go into it at this level of sort of leading it, designing it, troubleshooting it, building relationships, navigating all the complexities, all the different aspects of it. I mean, I think I lived on adrenaline for quite some time. So, when that sort of stops, and straight after this project, we went into the National Resilience Task Force. So that was intense as well. So it was 3.5 years worth of really intense stuff. I'm raising this because I think part of our experience might be helpful to others as well who are feeling, which, you can do. I did it myself fleetingly because I wanted to keep going, but to take the path of least resistance when you're dealing with big, bold projects like this and transformational change, it's hard work. And that sort of enticing, take the path of least resilience and just sort of get out or go and change it or something, is very appealing. And then I found that as I said before, that when I got together with everyone, that my view changed, because my God, I'm with kindred spirits here. There was a lot of really good energy. I'm getting my energy back, my focus back. So I guess the point being, the connection to other people is and will always be an incredibly valuable thing. Would you like to talk about your leadership experience in there? You don't have to.
No. I just totally yes. It's important to talk about it because that's how you learn. So I think for me, for me it was almost the easy part was designing the workshops and running them. I'm pretty extroverted, and I'm really comfortable with people, and after being lead facilitator on a ship with 120 people for 3 weeks, running a 1-day or 2-day or 3-day workshop is easy for me, particularly when you work with a team. And I felt like going back to my arts side, I feel like we were a band. It was like being in a band. Each person knew their instrument. But we got to the point in those workshops, I think, was a cross-organisational team.
We could read each other.
We could read each other. We knew what each person's strengths were,
Yeah.
and we could throw to each other by just a look.
Yeah.
And let them ad-lib. And so we were like a really good band. And I think the fact that we had that dynamic created that dynamic within the people who were participating. And so for me, that was really quite easy and invigorating, and it didn't really tire me. But then what happened was we had, I can't remember, maybe 128. So the workshops, in the workshops,
the data that
what we did was produce these participatory systems diagrams. And then what we had to do was distill, I think about 128 of these diagrams down into what are the typical system patterns, which means the patterns that happen regardless of which location and regardless of which type of disaster. And
that's a really important point there, that it rings true from whatever angle.
It has to be, because we were trying to unpack the systemic things. So no matter what disaster, no matter what, of course the responses to the disaster would be different because of is different than but all of the longer term things, the mindset, the leadership styles, all of the soft things, the governance structures, as well as the provisioning systems, the systems of how do you distribute food, water, manage sewage, all of those things. Once the system's broken, it doesn't matter whether it was a flood or a fire, you're still got to fix it.
Exactly.
With a traumatized region. So that was the part where the intellectual horsepower, and that was mostly myself, Nikki Grigg, Shona Mahag and Jackie Myers.
And
I had to take those diagrams and distill them into something that everybody using a language that was going to stand up scientifically.
Effort that you guys did.
But we wanted it so that anyone who attended a workshop would be able to see that diagram and go,
and understand it.
That's what I was talking about. That's what I contributed to. And find the level of language that would pass muster for the umpteen scientific reviews that we had to go through, but was still meaningful to people who were in the room and people who were not in the room, who don't want to look at a spaghetti diagram and go, there's another spaghetti diagram. So distilling them into, I think we came up with 15 or 13 system patterns.
We did.
Each with a simple
explanation
cause,
with it,
effect, what the main feedback loops were, how you might shift the system, so where the points of system leverage were, and then a simple narrative, a one paragraph narrative to understand what's the story being told by this diagram. What does it look like in peacetime?
That's right, yes.
So for example, during peacetime, all of...
enjoyed stability for a long time.
And then economic efficiency is prioritised over redundancy or diversity.
Our intention.
What are the values that are prioritised and the system is then optimised for during good times? And that's what creates the vulnerability.
Prosperous future.
For when there's a big perturbation, that's creating the vulnerability. So if you have a system that's totally optimised for economic efficiency, long value chains with the cheapest product, you could see what happened during the pandemic. Everything fell apart. And so then trying to work out if you want to build back, most people, when you lose something, you want to regain what you lost. And so you want to build back what you had. And that's the easy pathway. But we know that just reinforces the vulnerability.
Exactly.
So
that's a really
how
important
do you
point.
build back something that's different?
And you have to, in the first place, have the mindset to actually do that, to not think immediately about building back the same way. Wait a minute, we need to actually think about what can we do differently now to overcome that and deal with that vulnerability that we now know exists.
That's right. And particularly with critical infrastructure, where it's required to provide a function back on its feet as soon as possible. That is a really difficult thing to do, which is why it helps when the thinking starts beforehand. But you know, that the overall system pattern that we came out with, I mean, that has had that is relevant in every situation since, which is that people value things. Everybody values things differently.
Before disaster. Yeah.
Everybody values things.
Yeah.
The things that are valued are then codified into societal rules via policies or cultural norms or whatever. And usually the values that are encoded are the ones that are held by people who have power. Yeah.
You
so
took the words out of my mouth.
You cannot
the distribution
divorce it from power. So in a society where wealthy people hold power, the values that they hold will be codified into the rules
and
to perpetuate that system.
The legal system,
not just the legal system, but the business models, the way people think about the way everyone else thinks about what's important.
Yeah.
And then when there's a big perturbation and it breaks, of course the people who hold the power want to continue to maintain the system in a way that continues to benefit them. And that's what we've seen, is that the gulf of inequality has just got wider and wider.
Yeah, exactly.
So to try
there's a fundamental flaw in the systems.
There is.
The systems of society at the moment,
because of whose values, and the narrowing group of people whose values end up being codified and prioritised.
Yeah.
And so I think through these workshops, as well as the dialogues that happened, before and since, and in all other sorts of ways, how do you bring a bigger set of values to the table? How do you cope with contested values and plurality? And then how do you codify that broader set of values into a more robust set of rules that serve everybody better? And telling the story in that way meant that we could, at the time that this work was published was under, I think Peter Dutton was head of Home Affairs, and
he was, yes.
Was Morrison or Abbott was? It was a
so
coalition
Michael
government.
was the secretary, and Peter Dutton was the Minister of Home Affairs.
Yeah. And the way that we had to frame it, so it had to have.
We might have to think about this bit.
Think about how we do it. Yeah, but I think
it has to be said. But I'll have to.
Let me think about a way to say. So as well as having.
I just don't want it to get political.
No.
Someone will. So if we can say what we need to say, I'll edit it.
Okay, so let me think about it. So when you do the systems work and you come up with a systems view like that, you have to make sure that the science is robust. You have to make sure that the people who attended the workshop can relate to the way that you describe it and the words that you use. And you have to make sure that the people who are the political leaders and the heads of departments can relate to that way of thinking enough, and that it's not easily politicized because of the language that's used.
Exactly.
And the evidence that sits behind it, that it's not pejorative language, that it's neutral language, and you can describe, this is how the system looks in a vicious cycle, which everybody can recognize. Here's how we could flip it to a virtuous cycle, which means that the system, the things that are driving the system are still the same things, but they're in a different state. And usually they're in a different state because different values have been prioritized. So instead of driving the system so far, so strongly with only economic efficiency, you might say, well, back off a little bit on the economic efficiency and include some functional redundancy and multiple, so for example, instead of having just one cheapest supply line, you might have 2 supply lines of something, which might not be as economically efficient, but it means if one goes down, you've still got another one. So those are the sorts of tensions that we outlined and tried to describe in language that was neutral and evidence-based, but still recognisable to people.
So you just touched on a really important point that I want to add to from my perspective and Monica's, when we were actually writing the material to go through the process of into the
policy
and the Australian New Zealand Emergency Management Committee and the Ministerial Council and then into Cabinet. And one of the things that right from the get-go with the project, and when I was talking about it with Mark early on, was this issue of, if you want to change the national narrative from what to what, well then how do you help the people who are in those leadership positions understand that this is the sort of a change that's occurring in Australia. This is the science underpins it. We've done some really deep diving into this. We want to give you proper guidance and advice so that disasters are not politicised and that all parties are able to engage in a process of really helping Australia be a lot more resilient in the future. And from the Australian government's perspective, because the states and territories hold the constitutional responsibility for responding to emergencies, the Commonwealth is there to support them when they request them. And, the Commonwealth's responsible for managing their own resources as well. So that sort of coming in and into the conversation, being invited in by the states and territories, but, the sort of country looking for national leadership. That national leadership also includes being able to talk about and have the right, advice and guidance
and language.
And the language to use. It's a brand new world. And so that's what we, with the work that we were doing all around, that what you just described with the technical work and the systems diagrams and the narratives that went with it, that concept went right up to the top.
Because you and Monica then took it.
We took it all
into policy
and distilled it down into a key essence of what we found with the project and what we felt was important for the country to take forward.
And that's gone into the international work as well.
It has. It's been adopted
last year or the year before?
The year before.
That went into the
Monica
international
wrote that
DR.
piece,
Monica wrote that paper,
So it's been published in the United Nations Disaster.
Yeah, it was one of the handful of papers where the full paper was.
It's the work has been recognised internationally. So that and I was just sort of with being able to find the right language and produce something that went into cabinet and came back, as Mark reminded me the other day, unedited. That was pretty profound.
Because it was agnostic language. It was
very
just
much
human
so.
language.
We worked hard.
Language,
We worked so hard on being able to do that. Make sure that we use the right. This is that sort of intersection of the policy science and response and the political world that is so important as well. And what came out of that, because we were able to get, do all of that remarkably, the National Resilience Task Force was next, and the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework is underpinned by the AVP work. So whilst there's been a few years that have passed, that work is still so fundamentally important and being progressed.
And states have taken up the running. So after that project
New
finished,
South
we then
Wales
worked with Queensland.
And Queensland,
I think
QRA, Queensland Recovery Authority,
really
grabbed it,
the next steps,
because they were the first cab off the rank, and we absolutely found their the magic in it, and took it and ran with it. So did WA, so did South Australia. It's wonderful. Okay. So we were talking. You were reflecting on yourself and Shona.
Shona, Nikki, and Jackie.
And Jackie.
Rice. Yes.
So I remember how I felt how remarkable that piece of work was when you presented it to us. Remember at Think Place in Canberra? And we put it all around the walls. And you had the room set up for when we came in, and that's when you presented it to us. And I walked in, and I'm like, oh, you've done this in how long? It was pretty intense.
That was hard.
That was hard work.
That was probably one of the things that's probably one of the times that stretched me to my intellectual limits, to be honest. Just how much information can you hold, synthesize and distill in your head. That it was good and it was satisfying, but it was very
I didn't.
I don't think I thought about anything for a couple of months. I
You
didn't
couldn't
think about
possibly
anything
have-
else.
you
You just had to,
couldn't,
because you
yeah.
had to hold it all in your
Yeah.
hold it all in your
Yeah.
head at one time. Yeah.
So I remember coming in and being astounded, and then looking around, and my challenge then was to get into your head
Yeah.
as to how these pieces are all coming together.
Yeah.
And I don't think there was much, I was going to say pushback, but I don't mean pushback, much more from myself or Monica. We could see it. I resonated with it.
I think you did more than that, if you don't mind me butting in, because I remember you coming in and just being amazed and saying, I want to learn this. And then do you remember, at that stage, I think we still had like 20 diagrams and we had to collapse a couple of them down. You took one. Do you remember?
Yeah, I did.
You took one. And
I
you
did.
said that you wanted to do the next level of distillation.
Yeah.
And so actually, one of the final sets was one that you took.
Yeah.
And you did a fantastic job. I mean, we sort of supported you doing it, but you actually took that and applied it yourself and mulled it over and kept coming back and going, what do you think about this? What do you... And you actually nailed it. Do you remember that?
I do remember having a sort of... Yes, I do, but not to that level.
I do remember which one it was, but one of them was your final product.
Yeah, I do remember doing one myself, and the final one. I've still got it at home somewhere.
Well, you'll know which one it is.
Yeah, I'll have to rustle it up. But I found, because I'm a bit of, I know now that for a long time I've been a systems thinker. I just didn't know that.
Well, that's what it was called. Yeah.
So, a lot of people I suspect are the same. They think they can't do it because they're not, seen as a systems thinker, but I bet they are if they really thought about it.
I think all children are systems thinkers, actually, and sometimes it's the more specialised your education, it's almost trains and siloed. You then go into siloed work environments in government or in industry. Actually takes that out of you, and that's why, actually, going back to our first point, why some of the work that we do in developing countries is so fantastic, because often, I mean, Yahace and I worked with people in the back blocks of Ethiopia, or Russ and James and Shona worked in Papua New Guinea, that actually they're natural systems thinkers and they haven't had that specialised education that
takes it out of them.
That actually narrows their thinking to a certain field or discipline or lens. But one of the things that I think was one of the most important things from the workshop, which is something that sticks with people. We at the end of every workshop we did, in that project and every other, we had questionnaires, and everybody filled in the questionnaire before they left. And I think probably the most top 2 items about what people thought they got out of it immediately. We've never actually known how to think about a system in a structured way before. And secondly, we've never done that as a group before. Because part of systems thinking is not just the flow of cause and effect and the logic and the testing of the logic behind that, but the multiple perspectives, and doing it in a facilitated, psychologically safe way that people could put forward really different perspectives on how they thought the world worked. And then we would sketch them out, and then we would challenge them, and then we would test them. So by the time all of those qualitative diagrams about people's mental models about how they thought things worked, when it came back to Nikki, Shona, Jackie and I, we would then have to go through the literature and say, well, where's the evidence? This is how, and it doesn't mean that, so if people think the world works in a certain way, you still have to capture that, even if it's not,
it's their reality,
evidence-based, because it's their reality. And then if you combine that with the fact, if you combine that with where they sit, you can't divorce any of this from power, because if someone's mental model is really wrong, but it might be a firmly held conviction that that's their mental model of how they think the world works, and then they have power, it can take, and I think we can see that with Trump and tariffs at the moment. I believe that his mental model, for whatever reason, is very firmly that if you impose tariffs, in his mind there's a cause and effect which has good outcomes, which is that America is great again. Now all of the evidence in the past is to the contrary, and of course that'll play out in real time in the coming weeks. But I think that was also part of the challenge in the workshops, is to do that participatory systems analysis that allowed everyone to explain their mental model without judgment from other people. Because it doesn't matter whether it's true or not.
It's there.
The point is that you need to understand how somebody's thinking that the world works, because that is as important as the truth of, not the truth, because, you know, that as the evidence about how cause-effect actually works. And trying to hold those things, which are often quite dissonant, in equal measure in the workshop, but then when we distilled the diagrams to really elevate the evidence-based cause-effect ones, that was quite a job. But people said that coming out of the workshops, even before the reports or any of the rest of it, policy or anything else came out, they had learnt how to think about systems in a structured way. They'd learnt to value the multiple perspectives of other people, even if they thought that they weren't correct. And through that, they had built what they thought would be ongoing relationships and trust with other organisations that they would take out of the room into their own. And I think if the project had stopped with the workshops, that would have been valuable. But it didn't. It went much more, went much further than that.
I remember also at the end of the workshops, there was an opportunity for anyone, to sort of stand up or sit down, but to put their hand up and reflect on anything that they would like to share with the group. And there was one in particular that really sticks in my mind, was the Western Australian workshop, and the local government mayor that was there, and his lived experience of sort of scenario that played out in his local shire, and so the honesty and the transparency and the willingness to share, the vulnerability of the mayor of that really struck me, as did a very senior person in the financial sector, who also reflected on the work that we'd just done and the scenarios that were explained, and even the mayor's lived experience that he shared, and some of the scenarios that really would have caused significant disruption, damage, harm and loss, who stood up and said, if that particular scenario had played out, we essentially would go out of business. So it was like a humongous aha moment of taking this person into, at an executive level, the existential crisis that would come from that scenario. Was cyclones that were cascading their way down the west coast, and the Pilbara, and the disruption to all the mining industries, and what are we seeing?
It's all happening.
Yeah. So the courage that it took for people.
It's probably important when we're talking about scenarios. I mean, I don't know whether any of the others have talked about the structure of the workshops, but
no, we haven't gone.
So what we did was we had narrative scenarios about the disaster, catastrophic disasters, but we also, so first of all, we built a container. So we asked people, what do you need for this to be a safe space for the next couple of days? People had to come for 2 days. They couldn't dip in and out. They had to make that 2-day commitment. And they were structured so that we first built the container, then we gave them some information. Mark was always there, as he was the Director General of EMA, and he was the person who provided the legitimising environment. That as the person who's in charge in this sector, I want us to think about all of this. But then then we asked them, how do you think the world, I think the first question was, what do you value? And how do you think it's working now? And they had their first go at describing how the world works. And a lot of it, they thought it was going okay, right? I remember sitting in some of the energy, they were pretty pleased with what they were doing in the energy sector or whatever. And then we asked them, we'd lift them up emotionally, that's where the endorphins came in. What is the future that you want? And they were not allowed to use words and pens and policy language. They had all sorts of craft material, and I remember some of the uniformed executives, the the uniforms, they would, and then Shona would bring out the chocolate frogs and turn it into a game. But we let them explore their imagination about the futures that they wanted, and we had some incredible creative pieces from that.
Absolutely.
Drawn and built and described. And then so everyone was on a high because it was a competition, the chocolate frogs. We came back after lunch, and then we ran the opposite of that, the catastrophic disaster scenarios. And that's what opened up the chasm and the dilemma between the future you want and the probability of the future that you're going to have. And then, and that's when we had psychologists sitting in the back room. We had EAP or, the various...
Ready to go.
There was a couple of meltdowns. We had enough facilitators in the room who had first aid, mental health, but we also had to have in place a lot of backup psychological. Because at this time we hadn't had Black Summer. We hadn't had a catastrophic. I think Canberra and Ash Wednesday were the two things we'd had that came close. And then Mark came in at the end of day one, really quietly, and just talked about compassion and compassion towards yourself and giving yourself time to process. And we deliberately ended the day on that note. And then we stayed together. We usually had a dinner that night. People could chat, talk it through, process it. Then we came back the next morning and we said, now take out your first set of systems diagrams about how you think the world's working. And do you remember how many of them just scrumpled up the diagrams, threw them away and said, no, we've got to start again? Others of them substantially modified where they thought the vulnerabilities were, what they thought they needed to do. And those are the diagrams that we used. And that was a really hard cognitive job. But then we ended the day, in the afternoon, we said, okay, so we've talked to you about evidence and systems thinking and cause-effect logic. But now what we want you to do is tell the story in any fictional way that you want.
That's right. Yeah.
And that was the endorphin burst. Yeah. And we gave them a story spine. Some people came out with stories about 3 pigs and the wolf. Some people came with plays and skits and stories of lived experience. We had a whole range, but each group told that systems diagram, not as a systems diagram, but as a fictional narrative. A, it was fun, but B, we actually got a different set of information out of that because given the seniority of people in the room, when they didn't have to stick with their formal role, they actually told us stories that were really insightful, that were not necessarily attributed to their formal roles, but you know that because of the insights they had, they were telling you something really useful. And that's where we got the vulnerability. People really showed their vulnerability. There was one play I remember, was it WA?
You're bringing back memories for me now.
Yeah, so we had this one group.
I can see them coming through, like people being locked out of the room.
They were locked out, that's right. So what they did was they took a vulnerable group of people out of the room.
And then knocking on the door.
And so then they had 2 people talking about the post-disaster recovery, and they're saying, decisions. and we're very inclusive of marginalised groups, and we've got our token marginal person here, and then all the other people in the play who had been not allowed in. They were banging on the door, and everyone in the room was going, "Is this an actual emergency?
Let them in.
What's actually going on here?"
Yeah.
So it became an experiential. And that was I think that was such an innovation, that use and that license to use fiction to explore how you feel, to have fun, but to know how to tell stories, to expose your vulnerability, not necessarily being you in your formal role, but just fictionalize it, the story of what you've heard. And it also made sure that we ended up the workshop with everybody on a high, because there was a lot of humour. I remember there was a lot of fun and a lot of humour. Yeah. So
serious humour, we knew how serious things were.
That's right. Yeah. And imagination. So I think that combination, and you see it's written all the time, that a lot of the situation we find ourselves in now is a failure of imagination, not just a failure of imagination for the catastrophic things that will happen on the pathway we're on, but a failure of imagination about what a different future could look like if we all pulled in that direction. What could it look like? And I think opening up that door to imagination being a valid part of policy design and a valid part of scientific exploration.
Exactly.
I think that was probably the single biggest innovation of that work.
You can tell, can't you, why this magnificent lady was part of the project team?